I was seated at the long dining table, back straight, hands folded loosely in my lap. The chair was the same one I'd chosen years earlier, oak, slightly too firm, impossible to slouch in. The room smelled like polished wood and citrus cleaner. Someone had opened a bottle of champagne before I arrived. The house was full, not crowded, arranged. His parents at one end, colleagues along the windows, friends who had learned which side of the story they were standing on. At the head of the table stood my ex-husband, glass raised, smiling with the ease of a man convinced the room belonged to him. He didn't acknowledge me at first. "To new beginnings," he said, arm settling around his fiancée's waist. "To building something better, something that's finally mine." A few people laughed. Chairs shifted. I noticed the place settings, new plates, unfamiliar silverware. The framed photos on the wall behind him had been changed. The house had been edited. Then he looked at me. "And since we're all being honest tonight," he continued, voice bright, confident, "I should probably clear something up." He gestured toward the ceiling, the walls. "This home is no longer a shared memory. It's not a we story. It's mine. It always should have been." The room tightened. Someone stopped mid-sip. His fiancée glanced at him, then at me, uncertain for half a second before recovering. He went on, "So let's avoid confusion. This is our celebration, not a reunion. And after tonight, I think it's best if you don't come back here." It wasn't said privately. It wasn't softened. It was delivered cleanly, as if he were announcing a seating change. I didn't respond. I looked down at the table instead. The surface had a faint scratch near my place setting, something I'd once insisted didn't need fixing. I let my fingers rest there. The moment stretched. He waited for something. A reaction. An argument. A crack. None came. There was a silence, then not awkward, not confused. Intentional. People felt it but didn't know where to put it. His smile thinned. He took a drink to cover the pause. "For the record, I said nothing because there was nothing to clarify. The statement had been made. Witnesses were present. Fairness doesn't require volume." The silence held for another beat, longer than polite. Then someone coughed. A chair scraped. Conversation restarted in fragments, softer than before. I stayed seated, still, and I let the moment finish without me. "My name is Elena Marrow." I was 39 at the time, living full-time in Seattle, where I'd built a quiet, stable life that didn't require anyone else's approval. I worked in commercial risk assessment contracts, compliance reviews, long timelines. The kind of work where details matter because consequences do. I'd been divorced for a little over a year. The paperwork was complete. The terms had been followed. There were no outstanding disputes. What remained between us was not unfinished business, only shared history, and even that had been divided cleanly. I owned my own townhouse a few miles north of the city. It wasn't large, but it was paid for. My days were structured. Mornings started early. Evenings ended on schedule. I had no dependents, no financial entanglements that required improvisation, and no appetite for public drama. That night, I'd driven out to the house because I'd been formally invited. The message had been cordial, polite, almost generous. I accepted because there was no legal reason not to, and because declining would have suggested a discomfort I didn't feel. The people in that room knew me in fragments. A former wife, a name attached to a story already revised. None of them knew how I made decisions, or how long I tended to sit with them before acting. That was fine. Stability doesn't announce itself. It shows up on time, observes, and leaves when it's finished. What happened that night mattered because it violated an agreement that had already been honored in full. During our marriage, we divided responsibility cleanly. I handled financing, planning, and execution. When we decided to build instead of buy, my credit secured the loan. My income stabilized the early years. I managed the contractors, the delays, the permits that stalled and restarted twice before final approval. He weighed in once decisions were ready to be signed. When his career slowed, I covered the gap. Not symbolically, practically. 12 consecutive mortgage payments came from my account while he recalibrated. The arrangement was discussed in advance. Temporary, documented, no part of it relied on goodwill or assumption. The divorce followed the same logic. Clean filings, agreed terms, no contested hearings, no theatrics. We divided what was liquid and assigned what was conditional. I didn't challenge the house at the time because it wasn't sentiment to me. It was an asset with rules attached. I understood those rules and I respected the process that governed them. What changed wasn't the structure, it was his behavior. Standing in that dining room, listening to him reframe the house as something he had reclaimed alone, I recognized the pattern immediately. He wasn't asserting ownership because something new had occurred. He was doing it because there were witnesses. That pattern hadn't begun with the engagement. It had existed in quieter forms for years. Contributions minimized once they were no longer useful. Decisions rewritten after the outcome was secured. Credit redistributed when the audience shifted. I didn't correct him because correction implies dispute. There wasn't one. The imbalance wasn't emotional. It was procedural. And procedures don't respond to volume. Fairness, when it's documented and patient, doesn't need defending. It waits. Looking back, nothing about the dynamic was hidden. It was consistent. He liked momentum without maintenance. Big decisions appealed to him as long as someone else absorbed the friction that followed. I was good at that part. I kept timelines moving. I noticed gaps before they widened. I documented things because documentation removed ambiguity later. When we were building the house, the delays were predictable. The first contractor underestimated costs by 6 figures. The second missed inspection deadlines twice. I handled the renegotiations. I restructured the draw schedule. I moved money between accounts to avoid penalties. None of that required discussion once the authority was established. He appreciated outcomes. He didn't involve himself in process. That division worked because I didn't require recognition to function. Reliability doesn't. It just repeats itself until it's assumed. Over time, that assumption turned into something else. Not gratitude, expectation. There were other examples. Joint investments I researched and placed conservatively while he spoke about risk tolerance without reading the prospectuses. Tax filings I reviewed line by line while he signed at the bottom. Even after the marriage began to thin, the pattern held. I handled what needed handling. He enjoyed the stability that followed. My silence during those years wasn't hesitation. It was position. I was learning exactly how the system treated people who confused visibility with contribution. When the divorce became inevitable, I approached it the same way. I didn't argue for symbolic victories. I focused on enforceable ones. I made sure the paperwork reflected reality rather than sentiment. Every decision was evaluated on durability, not optics. The house was the clearest example. It looked simple on the surface. A single property, one address. But beneath that, the structure was layered. Financing terms, contingencies, conditions tied to time and use. Those elements weren't hidden. They were recorded, acknowledged, and signed. I let the house go then because it wasn't finished doing what it was designed to do. That restraint wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't avoidance. It was calibration. I'd learned long before that people who mistake access for entitlement tend to expose themselves when they believe the matter is settled. All you have to do is give them space. Order doesn't rush. It accumulates quietly, waits for confirmation, and then enforces itself without asking permission. By the time he raised his glass that night, every relevant piece was already in place. The structure that governed the house existed long before the divorce, and long before anyone thought to celebrate inside it. When we decided to build, the financing required more than a standard mortgage. My income qualified us, but the risk profile didn't end there. I insisted on a layered ownership arrangement, reviewed by 2 attorneys and a third-party trustee. It wasn't unusual for projects of that size. It was cautious. It accounted for instability, market shifts, and life changes that rarely arrive on schedule. On paper, The house was held through a property trust with conditional equity release. The language was precise. Occupancy mattered. Maintenance mattered. Certain life events mattered. The purpose wasn't punishment or leverage. It was preservation. The asset was protected so that it couldn't be casually diluted or redefined later. After the divorce, the trust remained in effect. That wasn't contested. He retained use of the property under the existing terms. I stepped away because the agreement allowed for it, and because stepping away didn't dissolve my position within the structure. None of this was secret. The documents had been signed years earlier. Copies existed with the lender, the trustee, and our attorneys. No new rules were created after the marriage ended. Nothing was added out of spite or revision. What mattered was compliance. The trust required periodic confirmation that its conditions were still being met. Occupancy was one. Use was another. Material changes to the household triggered review. The language didn't moralize. It didn't speculate. It simply described consequences if thresholds were crossed. I didn't monitor him. I didn't need to. Systems like that don't rely on vigilance. They rely on disclosure and verification, both of which are automatic when people believe they're entitled to proceed without reading. 6 months after the engagement announcement, a routine notice was generated. Not by me, by the trustee. I received the same copy he did. A thin envelope, standard formatting, no commentary attached. I read it once, then set it back on the table. The wood grain ran diagonally under the light. Nothing about the document was dramatic. It didn't accuse or warn. It acknowledged the change and outlined the next procedural step. At that point, nothing could be argued, only processed. When people assume a structure no longer applies to them, they tend to accelerate their own exposure. The system doesn't respond to confidence. It responds to facts. And facts, once confirmed, move forward on their own timetable. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 9. A conference room with glass walls, neutral art, and a table long enough to discourage casual movement. The trustee sat at one end, 2 attorneys beside her. A legal assistant set out folders without comment. I arrived on time and took the seat closest to the door. I placed my phone face down on the table and folded my hands. No one spoke yet. He came in late, not dramatically, just enough to signal confidence. His fiancée followed, heels clicking too sharply on the floor. They sat opposite me. He nodded once, as if this were an inconvenience he expected to manage quickly. The trustee opened the meeting without preamble. "This is a procedural review," she said. Triggered by a material change in occupancy and household status, he frowned. "There hasn't been any." She raised a hand gently. "We'll get to questions." A folder was slid across the table. Thick, tabbed. I watched his eyes track the movement before he touched it. He flipped it open too fast. Pages shifted. The trustee continued. Dates were read aloud. Clauses referenced. Language confirmed. Each point was verified by a second voice. The room stayed quiet between sentences. Not awkward, deliberate. He leaned back. "This doesn't apply anymore," he said, louder than necessary. "We're divorced," one of the attorneys answered before I did. "The trust wasn't dissolved by the divorce." "That's noted on page 3. Silence followed. I focused on the glass of water in front of me, untouched. A thin ring of condensation formed near the base. He tried again. "You can't just change things because I moved on." "No changes were made," the trustee said. "The conditions were already in place." His fiancée spoke then. "So what does this mean?" That question landed differently. It wasn't defensive. It was worried. The trustee paused, just long enough for the weight to register. Then she explained the sequence. Review, reclassification, transfer of control. Each step conditional. Each step already initiated. He shook his head. "This is ridiculous. We'll appeal." "That option is outlined," the attorney said, tapping the folder. "Along with the timeline." I said nothing. He turned toward me then. His voice dropped. "You knew about this." I held his gaze for a moment before looking back at the trustee. "I'll defer to counsel." that ended the exchange. Voices rose after that. Not mine. Accusations. Interruptions. The trustee let them burn out before continuing. Every attempt to regain footing met the same response. Procedure. When the meeting concluded, no one stood immediately. Papers were gathered. The legal assistant waited until the room settled before opening the door. As we filed out, his fiancée stayed behind, speaking in low, urgent tones. He didn't look at me again. The outcome wasn't emotional. It was administrative. Once authority confirms the structure, reactions become irrelevant. What remains is execution. Justice doesn't announce itself. It's read aloud, recorded, and carried forward without regard for who believed the matter was already decided. The first challenge came through formal channels. Within 3 weeks, a notice of intent was filed contesting the trustee's determination. It was reviewed, denied. The language was brief and procedural, citing the same clauses already confirmed in the room. By the end of the second month, a secondary appeal followed. Different counsel, same outcome. The conditions hadn't changed, neither had the timeline. After that, the process moved without resistance. Control of the property shifted as outlined. Access was adjusted. Financial obligations were recalculated to reflect the reclassification. None of it happened quickly. It happened correctly. I wasn't present for any of it. By late summer, the house was listed quietly. No open houses. No signage. The sale closed below his expectations but within market range. The proceeds were distributed according to the trust. A portion was held back pending final compliance. That release never came. By the end of the year, his professional footprint narrowed. The address that had anchored his credibility was gone. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations shortened. People tend to recalibrate their interest when stability disappears. A brief notice appeared in a regional legal bulletin the following spring. Trustee action upheld. No further review scheduled. It ran for 1 week and vanished into archives. The engagement didn't last. Socially, the contraction was slower but visible. The gatherings moved without him. The house that had once hosted celebrations became a reference point people avoided mentioning. I learned none of this directly. It came through fragments, third-hand updates, administrative summaries I skimmed and filed away. The system did what it was designed to do. It corrected a misclassification and moved on. By the time everything settled, his name was no longer attached to anything that required explanation. The silence around him wasn't punitive. It was structural. Consequences don't need witnesses to function. They only require that the rules be applied consistently. Once they are, the rest takes care of itself. When it was finished, it stayed finished. I didn't mark the date or revisit the documents once the final notices were filed. The matter resolved itself the way properly constructed systems are meant to without requiring supervision, commentary, or follow-up. What remained wasn't satisfaction. It was alignment. The outcome reflected the original structure, nothing more. No one was punished. No one was rescued. The rules were applied, and the imbalance corrected itself within those boundaries. I kept my distance from the entire process, not out of restraint, but because proximity wasn't necessary. Order doesn't improve with attention. A portion of the proceeds was directed, as planned, into a small housing stability fund I'd established years earlier. It supported transitional financing for people rebuilding after contractual displacement. The contribution wasn't symbolic. It was consistent with why the structure had existed in the first place. There was no moment of confrontation after that. No closing conversation. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was final. I returned to my routines, early mornings, measured work, evenings that ended on time. Nothing in my life required adjustment to accommodate what had already been accounted for. Justice doesn't need to feel personal to be complete. It only needs to restore balance and then withdraw. I don't think about the house anymore. It served its purpose. Structures that work don't linger in memory. They do their job and disappear into the background. Some outcomes are loud when they arrive. The ones that last tend to arrive quietly and remain exactly where they belong.